Good evening and welcome to the Global Sport Lab Spring Speaker Series. The World Cup comes to Seattle. My name is Ron Krabill. I'm the director of the Global Sport Lab, and I'll also be the moderator for the series. Each Monday evening for the next 2 months, we'll be bringing experts in to speak about different aspects of the World Cup coming to Seattle. Seattle's hosting of 6 matches this June and July. And I want to make note of the fact, especially for those of you online, that we're actually in a sort of hybrid format here. So we actually have about 80 students in person in the room, as well as several of you online and growing as we speak. So just a heads up that you will be able to ask questions from both the online webinar and in the room. The online webinar will be using a platform called Slido, and we'll bring up a slide after our guest speakers sort of do some initial introductions where you can ask those questions. Before I introduce tonight's speakers, let me thank our co-sponsors, including the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at UW-Bothell, where I'm a professor, along with the Responsible Business Law Initiative of the Baer Institute at UW School of Law, and as well, of course, the Jackson School of International Studies itself. And let me also offer special thanks to the comms team from the Jackson School and many other staff folks at the Jackson School. It definitely takes a village to put on a series of events like this. So thanks everyone for their hard work. So tonight is particularly special because our webinar is actually doubling as a launch event for a new project of the Global Sport Lab called the World Cup, the Syllabus. The syllabus is modeled after activist efforts during various social movements you may be familiar with. So similar syllabi were built around Black Lives Matter, around Standing Rock, and several other social movements. So the idea behind these projects is to pull together an open source list of readings and media that can provide a bit more historical context and geopolitical analysis to current events. For someone who wants to dive deeper than the journalistic accounts that are sort of out in the present. So we've pulled together a group of the leading scholars of global football, AKA soccer, to curate the syllabus. And together, this editorial team put together a list of essential readings to better understand the World Cup, both women's and men's, and then organized them around 7 sub-themes: FIFA, migrations, protest and resistance, arts and culture, human rights, stadiums, and technology. And now, as of just a couple of hours ago, World Cup the Syllabus is live on the web, and you can find it at worldcupsyllabus.com. So with formalities aside, let me also acknowledge 2 other key members of the editorial team are also in the room. So Pavandeep Josan and Amelia Flores right here in the front row. Pav is a graduate student in the Jackson School and the managing editor for the project. And Amelia is a senior design major and the visual designer for the project. So thanks for being here. So with no further ado, let me introduce our speakers for tonight, Sean Jacobs and Martha Saveedra. Sean Jacobs is a writer and researcher currently based in the School of International Affairs at the New School in New York City. And beginning in September of 2026, he will be affiliate faculty with the Global Sport Lab here at UW. He founded the extremely influential Africa as a Country site, and currently edits the Substack 11 Named People, which focuses primarily on sports and politics in a global perspective. During the 2026-2027 school year, he will be a visiting fellow at the Urban Democracy Lab at NYU. Martha Saveedra was the Associate Director of the Center for African Studies at the University of California, Berkeley for 3 decades. Her publications include work on sport, gender, and development in Africa, agrarian politics and ethnic conflict in Sudan, and representations of Africa and Chinese popular culture. She is a board member of both Sport Africa and Soccer Without Borders, and she has been involved with football most of her life as a player, coach, scholar, parent, and fan. We are so honored to have both of you here, Sean and Martha. I've known both of you for quite a while, and I know both of you as incredibly generous scholars, but more importantly, people, just really great folks. And also people who really care about the sport of football. So glad to have you both here. I've asked Sean and Martha to each speak for about 10 minutes to set some context, and then we'll jump in with the Q&A. So Sean, why don't you get us started?
Okay, so thank you very much, Ron, for having me. Hi, everybody. Firstly, congratulations to Ron and the team for for the World Cup, the syllabus, and I also thank you, Ron, for inviting me and facilitating my connection to the University of Washington, Bothell. Like going forward, I really look forward to working with the Global Sports Lab. Okay, I'll say a couple of things. I'll say a little bit about myself to kind of place myself in terms of my relationship to football and the World Cup. And then I'll say at the end why I think the syllabus is very important and very useful in making sense of what is arguably the most important sporting event in the world. I mean, this could, from any perspective, even grudgingly, even people who love cricket, where cricket is, and if you look at the cricket in terms of India, I think nearly 1 billion people. That's the number one sport in India, but it still doesn't trump like football's more broader appeal. Cricket is largely a sport played by former colonies of the British Empire, right? So it's settler colonies in Southeast Asia, and then of course England. It's interesting that the colonies in the north, in North America, cricket never really caught on. Although now it is, there is an American cricket team, although it relies mostly on a sort of diasporic population from South Asia. But this is an interesting thing to also talk and think about. The best illustration, I'm always not the best fan of Bono, the Irish rock musician, but there is an ad that he made for the 2010 World Cup in South Africa. It was made for ESPN, and as I've said, like Bono does a lot of stuff that is bizarre, like this the sort of humanitarian work that he does, and on Africa as a country, you can read many good critical takes on that work. But I still think this ad that he made for the 2010 World Cup is probably the best thing ever. And essentially, I mean, I'm gonna not do a very good job of sort of capturing what he did in this ad, but he narrates this ad, which consists of these sort of rapid fire images that, sort of a rapid cut that goes across the screen. And his basic argument is like, you can talk about this or that, that there's war, there's oppression, there's famine, there's environmental degradation, there's struggles around these. And then he says, but there's 1 month every 4 years. I mean, he's being too optimistic, I suppose, when the whole world stops, and it stops for the World Cup. Now, the question is whether that's going to be the case with this World Cup. This World Cup seems to be, it seems to sort of be out of the ordinary. It's being held in the United States, and with that will come all the good and all the bad things that people associate with the U.S., particularly on the good side. This is one of those countries that is very diverse, and with that with population people from all over the world. I'm originally from South Africa, so I'm an immigrant here. There are, like, in any of the World Cups, when they held outside the US, they found that often more than half often of the people who were there, even though they have connections to other countries, like whether from South America, from Africa, but people who often from the US make up, if not the bulk, but the plurality of people who travel to these World Cups. So it'll be interesting to see when the World Cup is held here in the US. So just quickly about myself, because I know time's running. As I said, I'm originally from South Africa, and also I'm now in my 50s. So my first time that I sort of came to a sense of the World Cup, and some of it, I suppose, is like this. I'm assuming that I'm also going to have a sense of revisionism in which I'm remembering things, and which my thoughts becomes my memory becomes sort of jarbled with sort of things that I now look back on and sort of add to my memory. But I can distinctively remember that the first World Cup that I cared about was 1982, and it was the World Cup in Spain. And this is the World Cup at which Cameroon and Algeria, essentially, they did very well in the first round. This is the sort of the group stage. Neither shamed themselves. I think Cameroon played to 3 draws. Algeria only got knocked out because Germany and Austria played to a sort of a contrived draw, so both of them could go to the second round. And that World Cup also was one in which, because South Africa at the time was subject to a sports boycott, because of apartheid. And so you're identifying with players and teams that sort of look like you from elsewhere. And apart from the African teams who were solid, but not spectacular, the team that you did identify with at the time was Brazil. And this is also where I began my fascination with Socrates, the Brazilian football player who played for Corinthians, the Brazilian team. And it was because we didn't see the football from those places, but they came around every 4 years. And every 4 years to see the Brazilian team be incredible. Of course, they did. They got knocked out in that World Cup by Italy in '82. And then in '86, when Socrates played his last World Cup, they again got knocked out, I think, in the quarterfinals. So this is where that so the World Cup, the point I'm trying to make here is like the World Cup at once is the space in which Africans get to represent themselves. And just a little bit of back history. The first time that Africans were playing in the World Cup was after the end of the sort of swath of independence that came with the 1960s. And so by 1966, an African team was going to qualify for the World Cup, but then they had to play an Asian team in a qualifier. And so Kwame Nkrumah encouraged African teams to boycott the World Cup. So by 1970 was the first time that Africa had a direct route into the World Cup. Let me move on quickly. It's also where I sort of, apart from Socrates, it's where I identified with sort of the politics that represented by Diego Maradona, who is this very complicated figure in that his personal life is quite messy, but as a footballer, right, as a kind of like an incredible footballer, he represented in a way the third world. While the hand of God is seen in the West as sort of transgressing the rules of football. For people like myself, when I was growing up, we saw that as a transgressive act, like a sort of liberatory act. And also one other thing to say, maybe I could say a little bit more about this later. My first way that I encountered the World Cup, because of apartheid, South Africa was not allowed to see the World Cup. So in 1982, for example, I was following the World Cup in print. And then even before and around that time, there was this book by a British writer called Brian Glanville called The History of the World Cup. And so every 4 years they would update it. So I'd read this book at school. So my first memory of the World Cup is essentially reading about it and hearing reports about it. And it's only later on, so 1986, we got to see a little bit more like highlights and maybe one or two. Some of the games were live, but most of it was still, South Africa was still under a ban because of apartheid. And so the first real World Cup where I could see every game was 1990 in Italy, and with Cameroon's incredible, the way incredibly that Cameroon played. Why do I love the idea of the syllabus? I think there is a lot. There's a lot out there about football now. Like there's so much. Like it's like this kind of doom scrolling on various social media. There are endless clips. There's endless podcasts of like players recalling glory moments. There are people creating clickable content because of the latest controversy that people are sort of bringing up every day. So one cannot keep tabs with what's going on, and as a result, it's all decontextualized. You can't really make sense, or somebody's telling you that something's happening, and that's the first time that it's happening in modern football, but in fact, it's already happened before. Or you often don't know about, say, the deep history of South American footballers or the deep history of African or Asian footballers within the sort of the hierarchy of world football. And so what I like about the syllabus is that the syllabus brings people contextual content. As Ron said earlier, I participated in co-authoring some of the pieces that are the sort of introductory pieces that are on there on stadiums, on protests, and on art and politics. And then underneath every introductory essay, there are a series of questions to sort of invite conversation and debate. And at the end, there is a bunch of readings that people can consult. So I really appreciate that that the Global Sports Lab is doing this. It's an incredible opportunity for people to learn about this deep history, this just the way, this thing I was saying about how I came to the World Cup. I think if you don't have something like the World Syllabus, then it can be flattened out, and you think that the only sort of way to understand the World Cup is through certain kind of media, Euro-American media. I also think what the World Cup syllabus can do is to provide you with that kind of deep history that people often think don't exist. So, for example, in North America, I know Martha can say a lot more about this, but in North America, for example, both in the men's and the women's game, there is a deep history of football. It's equally tied up to the rise of modern capitalism, with immigration. It's been, as I said again, these things get flattened out because they become sort of mediated by television, by commercialism, and by the interest of sort of big money. But there's a deep history of soccer in America that I think something like the World Cup syllabus can bring to the fore. Yeah. So thank you very much. Maybe I should stop there, and I'm happy to participate in questions.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Sean. So I'll turn the floor over to Martha, who can also give some introductory comments, and then we'll open up for Q&A.
Yeah. Well, first, thanks to the team at the Global Sports Lab and the University of Washington. And my mother was from Washington, so I love this to have this like good connection back with the state and the university there. I think to say about the syllabus, one really important thing that I've always felt is that when I sit back, when I really learn something when I go out to teach it. And then to do it collaboratively. One of the discussions I often had when I was working on African studies at the University of California, Berkeley, was when we were trying to create African studies, it would be great if we could collectively get everybody together and work on syllabi. That's not usually the way it happens, at universities. So to do something collaboratively with people, people that I know, and some people I've worked with closely, Sean and Peter, and I've worked with closely before. Others, Brenda, I've got to know better, but I had seen her before. I think you really do learn more. And then when you think about critically what it is that somebody should know, that's when we don't know. It's a blank slate out there. We don't know who we're working with, but we want to present this to you. In terms of my own journey in this, I will say, I mentioned this to Ron earlier, and I'll get to why this is important, but putting together a syllabus and then putting it online can create magical moments. So I'll get to how that can happen in the future. But I also say in terms of my own relationship to the World Cup, to FIFA, the personal is very political. And that phrase in and of itself marks me as somebody who came of age in the 1970s and 80s. I began playing soccer in the youth leagues in Prince George's County, Maryland. I played, in what was then the Washington Area Girls Soccer Group, WAGs. And for me, we didn't really have, connections to the World Cup per se. We were creating it new out of the ground. My father was one of the people organizing the leagues and the finding fields and things like that. So it was a new community. We had to create it from the ground up. And after playing, we had this great opportunity in the Boys and Girls Clubs there in South Bowie. One thing that's really important about that, my father and mother helped to create the Boys and Girls Clubs. Initially, they were only boys clubs, and because there were 7 kids in my family, 6 who were girls, my dad was like, we have to have girls in the title. And that I think makes a huge difference. When you intentionally put women in the title, it does make a difference. And it certainly made a difference to me. When I got to college, there weren't the colleges that I went to didn't have varsity teams in soccer and football. So we played club football, but then we kept on pressuring the college to give us, this was in Memphis, Tennessee, to allow us to become varsity. Literally, the women's team at the college that I went to, we were not allowed to touch the field. We were not allowed to go on the field. We played on a crooked, uneven field. And when we had other teams come in that we arranged games with, they would laugh at us because, the goalposts were crooked and everything. So we used Title IX, which some of you may be familiar with, to push the college. And it took 3 years. Finally, I graduated and played 3 games varsity. So yay. After that, I played in recreational leagues here in the Bay Area. I played when I was pregnant. I have a 32-year-old son. And when he was little, he used to say to me, Mommy, do boys play football? because he only ever saw me and women play football. So this is the world that I created. I also managed when my kids, I had two boys, I also coached and managed their teams. Um, Somewhere along the way, so I was playing soccer. I was also doing work. I'm a political scientist by training. Sean actually is also a political scientist by training. Um, but the work that I was doing was focused on development, on Africa, agrarian politics, and then I was running the Center for African Studies at Berkeley. Well, that was later, but initially I was teaching at another college, St. Mary's, and somebody said, "Hey, you have to teach a course," and I had to teach lots of courses. Why don't you teach a course on women's sports? Because I was always talking about women's sports. So I did, and this was back in 1992, 93, and I realized there wasn't very much literature on women's sport at all. Very little literature, almost nothing on women's sport in Africa or any part of the global South. And there wasn't much, certainly on women's football. So basically, I spent the next decade and two trying to put together material on women's sport in general. I finally got to go to Senegal and at the end of the 90s to do some research there on women's sport. Some of it was just documenting what's going on, but then also looking at the causes and the underlying um, uh, reasons why women do or don't um, um, participate in sport in general. And Sean brought up the word transgressive, and I think one of the things that's always been true for me, and this is the personal political part, is that as a woman participating in sport, and especially in football, in most of the world, it is transgressive. It is maybe less so now, but it has been a political act to participate, to demand space on the field, to demand access. And so when we look at the World Cup, we see that the official FIFA World Cup doesn't start until 1991. There were some other World Cups that were put together. There's some interesting documentaries and literature on ones that happened in Mexico and Italy and things beforehand. But literally, women were banned from playing football. The English FA, the Football Association, banned women from 1921 to 1971 from playing football. Well, how did they do that? It wasn't like they had the legal structure behind them to say no, women couldn't play. But if a club had women play, then they would, on their pitch, then they would uh, prevent them from participating in the men's side that the FA was doing. And because England, of course, and the UK was a colonial power and they're influential in other ways, this ban was extended in many parts of the rest of the world. So when you hear in other parts of the world, oh, girls don't play football. When I was in Senegal, for instance, and this was at the late 90s, there was and that's a former French colony, so maybe not the direct connection to the UK, but the statement that I heard a lot of people say that women were playing basketball and women were very successful at basketball in Senegal. But people would say, "Oh, basketball is women are graceful and it's a very respectful sport that women can be very feminine within it. Whereas women playing football, oh no, they were too masculine there and they were risking their femininity." If you were watching the NCAA, the tournament UCLA just won, I mean, women are tough playing basketball, so it's what people want to see. But this notion that women in much of the world, women playing football, women playing soccer, is very transgressive. So for me, this was an interesting area to bring in my lens for political science, the work on development, interest in how people who have been prevented from having access or for various structures, whether it's patriarchy or other kinds of structures, are not getting access to things when they would like to have access. So this is something that I wanted to study. I developed a course, and I'll go back to the syllabus here. In 2004, I developed a course on the politics of sport, which focused on development and other issues, but also on women's work in sport. And I put it up online. And when I did that, I then got connected. People from Switzerland contacted me and say, "Hey, we're going to be doing some events on the year of sport and physical education." They invited me to that in Switzerland. Some of my best friends now are the people that I met back then. And that led to a whole set of international collaborations, such that I was even on at one point a monitoring and evaluation scientific committee for FIFA on their Football for Good projects. So I actually got to visit the FIFA headquarters. I saw Sepp Blatter in the, in the lunchroom and things like that. Got to go to, never went to the Men's World Cup there because of that, but I went to the Confederation Cup in South Africa. That was in 2009, the year before. So partly I just want to say is that when you put your work out there, you may get opportunities. And so that's something that I, it is good to work through this and put the work out there. Again, when you do put together a syllabus, you really are thinking about what is it, as Sean was saying, how to get to the nuances, how to learn the larger histories. There are certainly tons of things. I was just watching on Instagram, and this is from the NWSL, two young players from the San Diego Wave who were meeting Marta for the first time because they were playing Orlando Pride. And these young girls were just like, I mean, they're players, they're professional players, but Marta is their hero. And they were just all bubbly and they couldn't even talk and they were laughing. And that's like this wonderful moment to see and that they know that Marta is yes, she's still playing, but she has made such a difference in the game for women. And, definitely is a hero to all of us. And I have to say, I actually met her once too, and I was just, floored meeting her. But that connection to history for women in the United States to understand the importance of Title IX. And as much as Title IX now is being used by the U.S. Department of Education for other nefarious things, it had a moment where it was really, really important to advancing women's sport. The work continues, though. I mean, within FIFA, Sepp Blatter, he long time ago said the future is feminine and all that. So, they've long known that the women's game is really important. And right now, I think I've just read something about that revenue from women's sports is far outpacing, the increase from any other sports. And so there's a lot of reason to focus on women's sports. But the way that it's going to be done, I mentioned that there were some international tournaments that happened before 1991. Those were not under FIFA. So understanding the relationship between FIFA and the women's game is really important. In the last Women's World Cup in 2023 that took place in Australia and New Zealand, as it was coming, there was an attempt. FIFA wanted to cut a deal with Visit Saudi to have them advertised. And all of these women, including women players, said, no way, and they pushed back on this because they felt that the situation in Saudi Arabia for women was not the kind of situation that should be sponsoring the tournament. That said, Saudi Arabia now is putting tons of money into women's football, and you have a big infrastructure there. They're trying, they're going to have their World Cup for women themselves in the 2030s sometime. At least that's what they want to do. A lot of players who are from around the world are now playing in Saudi Arabia, just the way the men's side do. They make money there, they get opportunities. So I think I came out of the 70s and 80s in terms of my political consciousness and understanding of the world. And then it was in the early 90s that I began to put that together with sport. And I think the thing about doing something like a syllabus is that you go deep and you put together these pieces. Some of them, I worked on the FIFA section and the human rights section. There's another section on the stadium. And I think, that's something that I don't know as much about. So I am really happy that I can go and look at that material and learn more about the stadium and how that affects the experience of all the different people and different institutions and organizations that work on football. So maybe I'll end it here, but again, thank you to the Global Sports Lab for giving me this opportunity. And I really appreciate everyone else that I was working with on this and look forward to any questions. So Ron, back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Martha. So I'm just going to change the view here. But let us take a pause for a moment here to let folks log on to the slido.com. So if you're joining us on webinar, if you go to slido.com, or I think we'll have a slide up in a moment that also has a QR code, and then you just enter hashtag GSL, then you'll be able to ask your questions through that. And then we'll be alternating questions between in the room and on Slido. In the meantime, I'm going to ask the students in the room to start thinking about their questions as well. And then first, I'm going to actually take the moderator's prerogative and ask an initial question of both of you. So Martha, you opened up this question really nicely with this question of the personal is political. So my question for both of you is, particularly for the students in the room, how would you answer someone who says, this World Cup syllabus is making politics out of something that should be free of politics? How would you how would you encourage them to reply to friends or family who might, as they start to dig into this syllabus and think about critical analysis of the World Cup, sort of push back against that sort of approach, if that makes sense? And you can both turn your cameras on so we can see you all.
Yeah, I'll just jump in on that. And if everybody's do their own opinion, if they want to say that sports are apolitical, fine, they can do that. But the fact is that sport is political. You have to, especially to put on a tournament like this, there are so many points where you have to mobilize resources. The host cities have to go out there, and they may be spending tax dollars or have to get permission to change this whole community for when these games are happening, or to prevent the vendors that are not supposed to be there from being there. So there's so many things that are political, and plus the way that things are decided in the back end, I would say it's just absolutely political. I mean, the definition of politics to me is when you are using your power, that could be your influence, your money, other sorts of leverage that you have over the people to get a particular outcome. And when that outcome is especially distributing resources or extracting resources, to me, that's political. So again, people don't have to agree with it, but I just think that it's always going to be political. So, and to understand the history of it, to me, it just provides a lot more nuance and makes it just more interesting. Sean?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be quick. I mean, firstly, I would say that, sports is never neutral because it inevitably reflects like the society that it's being played in. It's definitely affected by race, by class, by gender. And as Martha said, it's you are utilizing or which is the word, I'm looking for the right word, but you're using like land and local authorities and the national government and budgets. I mean, so at that level, it's also political. But it would be, if you ask me this, it's sort of, if I answer it from my South African viewpoint, I mean, it's like a no-brainer. Like in South Africa, if you just think as to like which sports were determined for which people, was a political decision. The colonists decided that, and then the white regime of South Africa, both during what was called segregation and then apartheid, decided that certain sports were for whites, i.e. rugby, cricket, other sports, soccer, boxing, they were for blacks. Then there were both white and black South Africans who rebelled against that. Like in the 1950s, for example, the best boxers were mostly white, some of the best rugby players in South Africa now are black. So people resist these kind of attempts to say, this is the kind of sport you have to play. I mean, in the US, the other one to use, and of course, the sports boycott in South Africa was key in defeating apartheid, isolating South Africa from just playing sport like nothing is going on back in South Africa, had an effect by the 1980s. You had white South Africans who by then were almost sort of exhausted with apartheid, but also feeling that they were isolated from the world. So that became part of the bargaining chip by the liberation movement against the white South African government, against the white community, to say, look, if you want to be part of the world again, if you want to play sport again, you have to change the policies of apartheid. at a political level. I think in the US, for example, the position of telling somebody you have to shut up and dribble, that's also a political position. By saying to somebody, you should keep politics out of sport, that is a political position because, you're talking about something that belongs in public life. Yeah. Because what you're trying to say to that particular athlete is that they should not have any political viewpoint, when in fact it's impossible.
Or denying visas to the fans of many different countries.
Yeah, exactly. That's a completely political position that certain countries from the so-called nominally global south or third world, Haiti, Iran, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, are subject to travel bans. That's a political decision. So, you can't just pretend you're just going to enjoy the thing.
Perfect, thank you. So I'm going to ask for a question from the room. Just so you know, keep it fairly concise because I'm going to have to repeat it for the audience as well. Who has a question? Yeah, go ahead. Fantastic. I'll do my best to repeat it, so let me know if I get it wrong. So the question was given the background that actually all three of us have in African studies and sort of the expansion of African teams. Do you see any differences in how African nations might use the World Cup or sport as a soft power tool?
I mean, I think if you look back, they've used it already. They've used it consistently. I mean, I was relaying, so I should have backtracked. Like Egypt, I think were part of the 30 or 34 World Cup. And as I explained that after there was a slew of independence. So Ghana, south of the Sahara, Ghana gains its independence in 1957. The next World Cup is in 58 in Sweden. Too soon to participate. So then you have the World Cup in 62, and then by the time of 66, African countries were they had enough standing in the world. They'd actually played a big role, as I was mentioning, the boycott of apartheid, to convince both FIFA and the IOC to begin to look at apartheid South Africa. And so Kwame Nkrumah, as I said, basically told the 16 African countries who would potentially qualify that they should not participate in the qualifiers and just skip this World Cup and force FIFA to kind of give them a direct qualifying berth. In other words, instead, as I said, qualifying through another continent. So they use that to sort of insist on their presence on the world stage. Then in 1974, when the president of FIFA at the time was an Englishman, Stanley Rauch, who was quite racist, openly supportive of South Africa, and then a Brazilian chairperson basically using that kind of combined forces from the third world, particularly African countries, using their votes to dethrone this guy and to sort of usher in a new history of FIFA. That actually resulted in African countries getting to play in more of these youth tournaments. So you start seeing Nigeria and so on win these the age group World Cups. And then, as I said, when Cameroon does really well in 1990 and beats Argentina in the opening game, that's also the year in which Nelson Mandela came out of jail. So there's something about that moment that it sort of ushers in something new. So Africans have been saying for a long time, we'd like more places at the World Cup. I'm not happy that we're having a World Cup with so many teams in it. I'm not sure this is the best way to run a World Cup. But if it does mean that I think we have 9 teams, we're going to have 9 teams in this World Cup. So for that reason, I think it's great. I think with time, it looks like with the performance of Morocco in the last World Cup, showed people that Africans are here now, that we can do well at this level. I think it's too bad Nigeria didn't qualify. But I do think that particularly Morocco, will represent Africa well in the next World Cup. So yeah, the World Cup is kind of a space in which you sort of announce yourself on the world stage, and it becomes a space in which you can prove yourself there.
Yeah, and I'll also mention, I mean, so focusing on the men's World Cup.
Oh, I was going to say on
Yeah,
the Women's World Cup, the
yeah,
last one was particularly impressive. Yeah.
yeah. The for the on the men's side, and maybe going from the recent men's AFCON Cup to this
Oh,
coming
Lord.
World Cup,
Yeah.
both Morocco and Senegal have invested a lot on the men's side in particular,
Yeah.
somewhat on the women's side, somewhat, to do really well. And that's one of the reasons why you had this clash at the end, I think.
Yeah.
But I think for me, in terms of the men's World Cup, one of the most iconic games, and I'll say, at the time, this was 2002. I was a single mother. I didn't have cable, so I watched all of the cups in Spanish on over the air because that's the only way I could get them. So I was watching the game in Spanish, watching Senegal beat France in Korea. That was just an amazing. It meant a lot to Senegal. And it was, even though, as it was, if you looked at the France team, the French team, was the Blanc et Bleu, it's definitely a team that represents the colonial past of France and the very multicultural contemporary moment of France, which continues the case with many of the European teams. But for France to beat for Senegal to beat France, and France had been the prior winners of the World Cup in 1998, it really meant a lot. Now, of course, the Senegalese didn't get much farther past that, but it was really an iconic moment. But I think one of the issues with, using for African teams and maybe other, even Brazil to use sport and use the World Cup as a national soft power. I mean, of course, if you host it, Brazil hosted the games, South Africa hosted the games. That's one way to use it as a and Brazil will be hosting the next Women's World Cup. That's a way of projecting soft power through the World Cups themselves. But I think that the amount of money that it takes to develop players and to really bring up to snuff, and it's not just having good talent, it's uh training and having that training space. I mean, Morocco has invested so much into this. Senegal a little bit more recently into this. It is hard for many countries that are having all other kinds of financial and political and other issues to do that. So, where are the funds coming from? And it's not just money. I mean, it's organizational talent, the amount of corruption throughout, from leagues, federations, individuals, agents up and down. I will say that the World Cup is a great space for individuals to get noticed and to get contracts. And so it is a place where people do go. I mean, they're definitely playing for their team, but they do know that it is a global stage. And at that point, you will see. I mean, you could look in the women's game now and how much more international it is. And it's not just the World Cup. I mean, agents are looking all over the place all the time. They're not waiting for the World Cup to find players, but it is a showcase in that sense.
I just wanted to add like something to some other thing quickly, and I think Martha said some of it, which is the one African team that has, or country that has used football, I would say, as a soft power tool, has definitely been Morocco. I mean, there's the way that they not just spending money on building like an infrastructure both in men's and I think increasingly in women's football, but and then on top of it, the sort of relying on the diaspora, because there was an argument that you should create homegrown talent instead of just sort of every major tournament you train with players who come from very different football systems all across Europe, and then they play in a tournament, they don't do well. Morocco's figured out how to combine that with sort of high tech training facilities, good coaching, etc. But the thing that struck people in the last couple of years is that Morocco's hosted almost every major tournament, both men and women's, age groups, whatever the AFCON, or what used to be called the CHAN, the which is for the locally based players, but now it's going to be called kind of like the Nations Cup. Morocco's hosted all those tournaments. If a country cannot play its games at home, so Eritrea, for example, has made it now to the main qualifiers of AFCON. When they play their home games, they play them in Morocco. So there's a lot of way in which I think in which Morocco, because Morocco has its own internal political problems, it has its own kind of complicated relationship with the African Union because of its occupation of Western Sahara, because it's trying to do diplomatic work around that. So there's a lot of that Morocco is doing, I think, deliberately using football as a form of soft power. So for me, they are the major ones doing it. South Africa did this a little bit just in the immediacy after the end of apartheid. But I think South Africa doesn't feel like South Africa needs to do that anymore. But Morocco is definitely doing that, yeah.
And during the AFCON, it was interesting to see the European Union also advertising. So there was this definite, hey, Europe, we're still here. We're still, part of it. So that's
Right.
and that also sets up the between UEFA and FIFA on two different sides of Switzerland, the contest between those two.
Yeah, I'll just add one other small wrinkle to that is a country like Rwanda, where I've been doing some work recently, where they're actually not going to be able to field a competitive team anytime soon. So they're putting all their energy into the hosting piece of it to sort of being the sort of benefactor of the sport without necessarily putting the team up.
Particularly basketball and kind of cycling, like the road, the sort of the Tour de Rwanda or some other. Yeah.
And cricket. I went to the opening of their cricket stadium. It was quite something.
Excellent. All right, I have a question from online, and Sean, connecting this to some of the talk you've just been talking about, sort of South Africa's history around apartheid. Has there been any talk about barring Israel from this World Cup? And I might just add to that.
I mean, Israel didn't qualify, so there's no attempt to. There's no reason to bar Israel. I know Trump had said something to the effect of, when he makes all kinds of loose comments about I assumed he meant like if a team would be barred, then I suppose somebody else can take their place, but then FIFA has to control that. But with some of the action around Trump, you don't know whether things that you might have thought was impossible, they might happen. But I think just sort of practically, they haven't qualified. One, they have to go through UEFA, and they haven't qualified through their group. I think they finished maybe like near the bottom end of the qualifying group they were in. And then I think secondly, if one of the teams that, like I know with the question of whether Iran was, whether there was pressure on Iran, said, no, we don't want to go because of the war that Israel and the US is having against them. And then they've asked if they could play their games in Mexico. I don't know what happened to that, but there was a story that if they don't qualify, then the next team that was in their group would then have the next two teams would have a playoff, and then they would be the team qualifying. I would say though, there is a larger movement. There is a long kind of movement that I think in the more recent past is gaining sort of momentum. It's definitely in Europe because that's where Israel plays. So Israel, after the Oslo Accords, Palestine played then in Asia and Israel played in Europe. And Israel, by the way, used to play in Europe until in the early 70s, a number of Asian countries refused to play against them. And so they were, for a long time, they were not playing in any confederation. And eventually they make a comeback playing in UEFA. So what they're now facing is that finally there is a movement in Europe, mostly fan-driven, like in particular countries like in Scotland, Ireland, Spain, where there's very strong fan movements to sort of isolate Israel, where they're trying to force their teams, their national teams or their club teams not to play against Israel. In the most recent case, there was a story that Ireland were interested in just forfeiting a game rather than play Israel. And then the final parties, there's also been where prominent footballers, I would say like Hector Bellerin, maybe former players like Frederic Canute and others, and also the the Moroccan player who played at Schalke, I forget his name now, who just won his court case again against the German FA. Sorry, not Moroccan, he's a Dutch player, Dutch-Moroccan player. So there's been a movement, I think, in Europe, which is where I would suppose is the sort of the ground zero of this politics, to isolate Israel more. I think in other parts of the world, and then at the same time, there is a way in which Palestine, and I'll stop with this. There's a way in which Palestine, the BDS, has a campaign on Israel. My opinion is it hasn't been very structured. I think what has been maybe more interesting has been how Palestine has operated sort of at a popular level and sort of to the reference that, and I saw that clip Martha's talking about with Marta. There's these kind of clips that go viral. So one was this clip that was at the Olympic Games in Paris. I think Israel was playing a West African team. I think it was Mali, and a fan made a comment about how well. He was just talking about football, about Mali playing very well against Israel, and these two Israelis kind of started making sort of, saying like, don't talk bad about Israel. He said, I wasn't talking about you. I was talking about Mali. And then he said, free Palestine. And then that became a thing. And so that's the point I'm trying to make. There is at a popular level in which the sort of the Palestinian, the attitude about the occupation, etc., has changed. And so the last World Cup in 2022 in Qatar, one of the things that happened there was a sort of unofficial, there was this kind of popular notion that Palestine was the 33rd team at the World Cup. And you saw this not just the players on the field when they were sometimes celebrating like Morocco, but in the stands, there was this presence of Palestine among supporters of these various different teams. Yeah.
And I'll just mention that, like much of the world, Israel didn't really have a women's team until 1997 when the FIFA basically said if you're going to participate in the World Cup on the men's side, you also have to have a women's side. So every now and then when a country wants to make sure their men play, they put a little bit of money on the women's side and get the women's side going. I will say that they eventually there is a women's league in Israel, and I know African players. I personally know some African players who have played in that league, so there's opportunities. But like the players that I know would rather play in Greece, than they would play in Israel. But it's a stepping stone in some ways, and the Israel women's side have not qualified for the UEFA tournament or for the World Cup. So, the amount of investment is minimal on.
I think the men's team last qualified, it was in 1970, am I correct? I think they were in the 1970. I think they did. I could be.
Yeah.
Maybe somebody could check it. I know we have the internet here, so somebody could check it, but I know they did qualify once.
Yeah. And I will just point out that the role of FIFA, there's this sort of, the good side, the bad side of FIFA. FIFA makes a lot of things happen. So recently what they've said is that every women's team that is going to participate in tournaments have to have a women's coach. Or official. No, is it just one, or I haven't looked into all the details yet. But that will also change a lot of things if there's, in developing the talent on the officiating side, on the coaching side. What would be really, if you want to be really transgressive, if that rule also applied to the men's teams, so that, the men's teams, if they had to have women coaches, and there are men's teams out there, in the professional leagues here and there. There's a few women, like there's a woman in Hong Kong. There was some women in the second league in France, and and women are, of course, on the medical side. You always see women on the medical side on a lot of teams. But to have more women at all levels of football, not playing, but in the official space, coaching and that would be.
I just checked. Israel did qualify for the World Cup in 1970. As an Asian team. They didn't make it out of the first round, but yeah, they did qualify. And they played in the World Cup in Mexico.
Good job. All right, one more question from the audience. Please don't be shy. Come on, someone has a question. Yes, Leah. US, yeah. Great, fantastic. So the question is, with the U.S. women's national team and the upcoming friendlies against Japan, they're playing 3 consecutive friendlies, including one here in Seattle at Lumen Field, which will be renamed the Seattle Stadium for the World Cup because it can't have its sponsored name. What are the strategic logics to holding those games, to hosting those games? What's the sort of the goal of hosting those games? Yeah.
I was just looking at a newsletter and they were talking about this, and basically it's that I don't know if it's just Emma Hayes, but the U.S. women's national team's infrastructure believes that Japan is one of the most serious um, contenders that they will have to deal with, and so they might as well get 3 games in and really hone things. And Emma Hayes, she is such a strategic thinker around how she approaches preparation that I'm sure she's thinking, yeah, we can get this in and learn a lot and get that experience. And, still getting the different players, the new players integrated, trying to decide on the teams. We still have a good year, before Brazil. So, but you might as well compete against the ones who you think are, and of course Japan just won the Asian
Yeah.
cup. So, they're flying high right now. Although they fired their coach right after that. So, like what's happening inside Japan at this point too. It'll be interesting to see. He wins the tournament, as coach, and then they fire him. So, we have seen that before, but yeah.
The Spanish national team in the World Cup.
Yeah.
All right, excellent. So thank you all for joining us. Martha, Sean, I can't thank you enough. We're going to give you a round of applause. I don't know if you'll hear it through the camera, but you've set us off on a really, really good start.
I think I saw an exploding
yeah, there you go.
an exploding hand thing.
Excellent. So thank you so much for your time. We really, really appreciate it. For those of you online, just a quick reminder that this is just the start of a series. We'll be going for the next 2 months on Monday evenings. Our next session, which I think you have a slide up now, is looking at the process of bringing the World Cup specifically to Seattle. Mary Harvey, who's a legendary goalkeeper for the U.S. women's national team, and also the head of the Center for Sport and Human Rights, wrote the human rights bid section of the bid, the United bid. So she'll be speaking with us. She's actually based here in Seattle, even though the Center for Sport and Human Rights is in Switzerland.
She's also a UC Berkeley alum.
There you go. That's not going to win you credit in this room. But, and then Leo Flor, who's the Chief Legacy Officer of the Seattle Local Organizing Committee, and Maya Mendoza Ekstrom, who is the forget what the exact title is, but I think it's Chief Operating Officer. It's but runs the Reign, Seattle Reign, and is also a key player on the Local Organizing Committee as well. So please join us for that next Monday. And again, thank you so much, Sean and Martha, for being here. We'll see you next week.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your round.
Thank you.
Take care. See everybody. Bye.